brains work the way that they do. For instance, the reason why we are better at detecting moving objects than stationary ones may be because this ability was useful in helping our ancestors to avoid predators. It is important for psychologists, as well as for those working in other scientific disciplines, such as biology and physiology, to be aware of those reasons. A difficulty inherent in the study of psychology is that scientific facts should be objective and verifiable, but the workings of the mind are not observable in the way that those of an engine are. In everyday life, they can only be perceived indirectly and have to be inferred from what can be observed, in other words, behavior. The endeavor of psychology is much like that involved in solving a crossword puzzle. It involves evaluating and interpreting the available clues and using what you already know to fill in the gaps. Furthermore, the clues themselves have to be derived from careful observation, based on accurate measurement, analyzed with all possible scientific rigor, and interpreted using logical and reasoned arguments, which can be subjected to public scrutiny. Much of what we want to know in psychology, how we perceive, learn, remember, think, solve problems, feel, develop, differ from each other, and interrelate, has to be measured indirectly. And all these activities are multiply determined, meaning that they are influenced by several factors rather than by a single one. For example, think of all the things that may affect your response to a particular situation, losing your way in a strange town. In order to find out which factors are the important ones, a number of other confounding factors have somehow to be ruled out. Complex interactions are the norm rather than the exception in psychology, and understanding them depends on the development of sophisticated techniques and theories. Psychology has the same goals as any other science: to describe, understand, predict, and learn how to control or modify the processes that it studies. Once these goals have been achieved, it can help us to understand the nature of our experience and also be of practical value. For instance, psychological findings have been useful in fields as varied as developing more effective methods of teaching children to read, in designing control panels for machines that reduce the risk of accidents, and in alleviating the suffering of people who are emotionally distressed. Historical background. Although psychological questions have been discussed for centuries, they have only been investigated scientifically in the past 150 years. Early psychologists relied on introspection, that is, the reflection on one's own conscious experience, to find answers to psychological questions. These early psychological investigations aimed to identify mental structures. But following the publication by Charles Darwin of The Origin of Species in 1859, the scope of psychology expanded to include the functions as well as the structures of consciousness. Mental structures and functions are still of central interest to psychologists today, but using introspection for studying them has obvious limitations. As Sir Francis Galton pointed out, it leaves one a helpless spectator of but a minute fraction of automatic brain work. Attempting to grasp the mind through introspection, according to William James, is like turning up the gas quickly enough to see how the darkness looks. Contemporary psychologists, therefore, prefer to base their theories on careful observations of the phenomena in which they are interested, such as the behavior of others, rather than on reflections upon their own experience. In 1913, John Watson published a general behaviorist manifesto for psychology, which asserted that, if psychology was to be a science, the data on which it was based must be available for inspection. This focus on observable behavior